Hey sweet people, and welcome back to my channel, or if it is your first time here, welcome especially. I'm so glad you've stopped by. Today's video is so important. We're going to be diving into the basics of the female cycle, and this is something that affects literally each and every one of us out there, women obviously, but also any man who has a woman in his life, but that unfortunately most of us are not taught about, especially in American culture. It is just not prioritized. We have this notion that we have our period, so we're either bleeding or not bleeding, but what actually happens in our bodies in that time, that we are not bleeding. Before we actually dive into the basics, I do want to just make a recommendation. I've talked about this before. This book, it is called Taking Charge of Your Fertility. It is by Toni Weschler, and it is one of my favorite books in the whole wide world. I think every single woman should read it. I will link it in the description box below. It is, a big book, but it is easy to read, it is enjoyable, and just create a time of study where you can really invest in your health and your well-being, and just in working your way through this book. And there are plenty of other great resources out there as well, but this is just the one that has really, really blessed me. So highly recommend it. So the female cycle has 4 different parts. You've got your menstrual phase, you've got your follicular phase, you've got your ovulatory phase, and then you've got your luteal phase. That menstrual phase is what we're going to be most familiar with. That's when your period is actually happening, and it is when your body has essentially realized that pregnancy has not occurred in that cycle. And so when your body knows that, so to say, your hormone levels are actually going to be at their lowest, and your body is going to shed the uterine lining along with the unfertilized egg. And once that is finished up, ideally around 4 to 5 days into your cycle, if our hormone levels are happy, if everything is working, ideally, we are going to move into our follicular phase. I'm sorry, words are hard. But in that follicular phase, our hormone levels are starting to come back up, and the body is actually preparing, for the release of the next egg. So those estrogen levels at this point in particularly are increasing. And the follicular phase and then the ovulatory phase are kind of going to go hand in hand, so I'm going to talk about them together. But during this time, estrogen levels are rising until we reach a certain point at which our LH levels, because of the estrogen, LH is your luteinizing hormone, and this is what literally causes the follicle to release an egg, causes ovulation to occur. LH levels are going to spike, which will cause ovulation to occur, an egg to be released, and at this point, one can get pregnant. So let's pause for just a second. If you have kind of picked up so far on what I've been talking about, you cannot get pregnant for your entire cycle. And that's something else that unfortunately women just are not taught. People as a whole are not taught. But there are only about 6 days of your cycle where you can actually get pregnant. And those 6 days come from the fact that sperm can survive in the body with the proper conditions for about 5 days, a max of 5 days. The egg itself can only survive for about 24 hours. And so if you were to have sex 5 days before ovulation, there is a pretty small chance at that point, but still definitely a chance that the sperm could survive to reach the egg. So that's where that fertile window comes into play. But there's the other factor of our body needing to be providing the right conditions for the sperm to survive. So that kind of happens in that follicular phase, going into the start of that ovulatory phase, that fertile window, as those estrogen levels are getting higher and your body is producing what we call a fertile quality cervical fluid. So if you've ever noticed that there's a certain point in your cycle where you have a little bit more moisture, a little bit more discharge going on down there. Well, that can be really annoying, I know, especially if you don't know what's going on, but what's really cool about it is that our body has literally been designed in that way to be hospitable to pregnancy, to sperm for only a short period of time. And so when we start to see an increase in discharge, and we can get more into what exactly that looks like in one of my fertility awareness method videos that I will link in the description and I can put up here on screen. But when we start to see that, that's generally going to be when we're entering that fertile window. And then towards the end of that, of course, you're going to see that LH spike, your egg is going to be released, and for the following 24 hours after that is when that egg is going to survive, and there's still the possibility of conception. So after about 24 hours after that egg is released, we are going to move into our luteal phase. That happens pretty much immediately after ovulation. And this is where the body is kind of, for lack of better words, hanging out, looking to see whether or not you got pregnant, is implantation going to occur, and protecting the environment that was created during that follicular phase, so that if pregnancy is to occur, everything that is needed is there. So what happens when we ovulate, as we talked about, that follicle that releases the egg is going to start to produce progesterone, and progesterone is really important to our health when it comes to just balancing out estrogen. It's often called a youthful hormone. It is really important to our bodies in many ways, but especially when it comes to being able to achieve pregnancy, progesterone levels have to be at a certain point or a certain level in order to be able to, number one, allow pregnancy to occur, and then number two, allow pregnancy to be maintained and protected for the duration. So it's really neat that there's this reaction that is caused when that follicle releases the egg. Now the follicle turns into the mechanism which is going to produce that nurturing progesterone and potentially take care of a future baby. So, okay, those are the 4 different parts of the menstrual cycle. I made a whole different video last week that goes into how to determine whether or not you're ovulating, and that talks about particularly how to use your basal body temperature to track your cycle, to again, in that context, determine whether ovulation is occurring or not. But I will touch on that here briefly as well. In order to determine where we are in our cycle, we can use that cervical fluid like we talked about. We can also use a thermometer. My favorite is called the Temp Drop. I'll link it below, but it's something you can wear on your arm when you sleep so that when you wake up, you have the data available to you. And it's going to show you essentially when you have ovulated due to an increase in temperature. It's going to give you indication as to when your period is coming up, and it can even help you know if pregnancy has occurred, or if your temperatures are staying high enough to sustain a pregnancy were that to happen. So again, I have made videos where I go in depth into tracking your cycle to prevent pregnancy, and even talked a little bit about pregnancy achievement by tracking your cycle. But the biggest thing to realize with all of this is that there are only, again, about 6 days of the month where a woman can actually get pregnant. And hormonal birth control in particular can do so much harm to our hormones that when we could simply be using a barrier method or abstaining for those 6 days of the month where we could get pregnant, it's just a shame in my mind to unknowingly be doing harm to our body, by putting artificial hormones into it in the form of hormonal birth control. And there's no shame, if that's a decision that you've made, but I think that every single woman should be educated about this so they can consciously make that decision. We can't get pregnant all month long. We can know when we can, and then we can take the necessary steps to avoid that and to, plan our families as we would like to do so. But that's going to be it for today. Again, just kind of a cursory glance over the female reproductive, or rather the female cycle as a whole, and this notion of tracking it. I would love to know if y'all have any questions. Please definitely drop them in the comment section. Other than that, though, I'm going to sign off. Until next time. Bye, y'all.